Most people think the British Empire rose because of wealth, power, or destiny. But what if I told you it began with desperation, with hunger, with fear, with a tiny island nation staring out at a vast, dangerous world, knowing that if it didn't grow, it would disappear? This is not a story about kings and crowns. This is a story about survival, ambition, and a gamble that reshaped the planet. And once you hear how it really started, you'll never see the world map the same way again. Britain, in the late 1400s, no global power, no vast colonies, no mighty navy ruling the seas, just a small, cold island on the edge of Europe, often invaded, often ignored, often struggling. While Spain and Portugal were already slicing up the New World like a feast, Britain was late to the table. Gold, silver, spices, and trade routes were being claimed by others, and in London, merchants, nobles, and sailors all felt the same fear creeping in. If we don't act, we will be left behind forever. England didn't have endless armies, didn't have the richest treasury, but it had something just as dangerous: restlessness, curiosity, and a growing belief that the ocean wasn't a barrier, it was a highway. Every ship that left port carried not just goods, but hope. Hope that somewhere beyond the horizon was a chance to change their fate. But the world was not welcoming. Early English expeditions were brutal, uncertain, and often tragic. Ships vanished, crews starved, colonies collapsed. For every success, there were 10 disasters. Yet instead of quitting, England learned. They studied what failed, they adapted, they refined, and slowly, quietly, they began building something far more powerful than an army. They built a system, and this is where the real story begins. While other empires focused on conquest first, Britain focused on control. Control of trade, control of shipping lanes, control of money, control of information. They realized that you didn't need to own land to profit from it. You just needed to control how goods moved in and out of it. British merchants began forming companies that looked harmless at first: trading companies, shipping companies, charter companies, but behind their polite names were private armies, private navies, and political influence that stretched across continents. These weren't just businesses, they were empire builders. The most famous of them, the East India Company, started as nothing more than a group of investors. They didn't wear crowns, they didn't sit on thrones. Yet within a century, they would rule more people than many kings in history ever did. They could wage wars, they could sign treaties, they could topple rulers, and they answered not to the public, but to profit. This became the British way. Instead of marching in with flags and fanfare, they slipped in through contracts, ports, and trade agreements. They didn't conquer first. They negotiated, then they financed, then they were influenced. And when resistance appeared, only then did the soldiers arrive. By the 1600s, Britain was no longer just a country. It was becoming a network, a web of ships, ports, warehouses, and alliances stretching from the Caribbean to India. Sugar, tobacco, tea, spices, cotton, these weren't just luxuries, they were power, and power was addictive. As trade exploded, British ports came alive. London became the beating heart of global commerce. Ships arrived daily, heavy with goods and stories from lands most people would never see. Taverns filled with sailors speaking of storms, strange cities, and distant wars. Newspapers spread tales of adventure and opportunity, and with every story came the same message: the world is open, and it can be taken. But this growth came at a cost, a massive cost. To fuel its rise, Britain needed labor, massive labor, cheap labor, and that hunger helped power one of the darkest systems in human history, the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of Africans were torn from their homes, shipped across oceans, and forced into brutal lives of bondage. Their suffering became the invisible engine of imperial wealth. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean, cotton fields in the Americas, and profits flowed into British banks, British factories, British cities. And with that money came roads, bridges, universities, and fleets of warships. The empire was literally built on human misery, but this part of the story was often hidden. Instead, the public heard tales of glory, brave explorers, of noble missions, of civilization spreading to the uncivilized. The empire didn't just conquer land, it conquered narratives. It told stories that made domination sound like destiny, and people believed them. By the 1700s, Britain had done something remarkable. It had turned the ocean into its backyard. Its navy was no longer defensive. It was dominant. British ships didn't just protect trade, they enforced it. If a rival threatened British routes, it wasn't debated. It was destroyed. France, Spain, the Netherlands, one by one, rivals were challenged, weakened, and pushed aside, not always through massive invasions, but through blockades, strategic strikes, and economic warfare. Britain learned that starving an enemy's economy could be more effective than defeating their army. And then came the moment that changed everything: the Industrial Revolution. While much of the world still relied on muscle and hand tools, Britain began to mechanize. Steam engines, textile machines, ironworks, factories. Suddenly, Britain could produce more goods, faster, and cheaper than anyone else on Earth. And now, it didn't just need trade routes, it needed markets, lots of markets. Colonies were no longer just places to extract resources. They became customers, forced into dependency. British goods flooded local economies, crushing traditional industries. People had no choice but to buy British. It was an economic conquest without firing a single shot. When people resisted, then the redcoats came. India became the crown jewel of the empire, not because of its beauty, but because of its value. Its textiles, spices, labor, and population made it irresistible. The British didn't arrive as rulers, they arrived as traders. They offered protection, then loans, then influence, then control. By the time local rulers realized what was happening, it was already too late. Entire regions fell under British rule, not through invasion, but through contracts that became chains. This was empire by paperwork, empire by debt, empire by dependence. And the most dangerous part was that many of the people benefiting from it never saw the violence. They sipped tea in London, invested in companies, and read about progress in the newspapers. They had no idea, or chose not to know, what was happening thousands of miles away. By the early 1800s, the British Empire had become the largest empire the world had ever seen. It stretched across continents, controlled key ports, dictated global trade, and ruled the seas. Its currency became trusted worldwide, its language spread, its laws spread, its culture spread. And with every expansion, it rewrote the rules of power. But here's the question no one asked at the time. How long can something this big survive? Because empires don't just rise, they crack, they strain, they rot from the inside. And Britain was no exception. As the empire expanded, so did resistance. Colonies began to ask dangerous questions. Why are we ruled from far away? Why do we send our wealth overseas? Why do we fight wars that don't benefit us? The first major crack came from a place Britain never expected to lose: America. The American colonies were once loyal, profitable, and growing. But taxes, control, and lack of representation turned frustration into fury. When the colonies broke away, it sent a shockwave through the empire. If America could leave, who else might follow? Britain adjusted. It tightened control in some regions and softened its approach in others. It learned to rule not just through force, but through influence education systems, legal systems, infrastructure. It planted parts of itself into every colony, making separation harder. And yet the more it controlled, the more it had to manage. Wars became constant. From Europe to Africa to Asia, British forces were always fighting somewhere. Each conflict drained money, lives, and stability. The empire began to feel the weight of its own size. Then came the World Wars. Two global conflicts shattered the illusion of invincibility. Britain fought bravely, but it emerged exhausted, broke, and changed. Colonies that had fought alongside it now demanded freedom, and this time they wouldn't be ignored. You are living inside the aftershock of the British Empire, and most people never realize it. This wasn't just a story of conquest. It was a story of systems, of strategy, of psychology, of slow, deliberate control. Deliberate control. The most powerful forces in history don't always arrive with armies. Sometimes they arrive with contracts, with loans, with promises, with opportunity. By the time you realize what's happening, the world has already changed. Do you think the British Empire truly ended, or did it simply evolve? Tell me your thoughts in the comments.